They surrendered believing the war was not truly lost. For many German soldiers taken prisoner in North Africa and later in Europe, defeat felt temporary, almost technical. They had run out of ammunition, or been cut off from their units, but in their minds Germany still held the advantage. The Reich, they believed, was built for war in a way its enemies were not. Even in captivity, this belief gave them confidence and helped them endure the humiliation of surrender. That confidence had been carefully constructed long before the battlefield. Nazi propaganda had spent years shaping how German soldiers understood the United States. America was described as a loud, divided society, rich but weak, full of factories that produced consumer goods instead of serious weapons. German troops were taught that Americans lacked discipline, patience, and the ability to sustain hardship. According to this narrative, the U.S. Army relied on money and numbers, not skill or endurance. Many soldiers accepted this view without question, because they had never seen America with their own eyes. When these men were first captured, their expectations remained intact. They looked for signs that confirmed what they had been told. Yet small details began to disturb the picture. American guards were calm and organized. Procedures were followed carefully. Supplies seemed endless. Food arrived on schedule. Vehicles were new, fuel was plentiful, and equipment was standardized in a way German units could only dream of by the later years of the war. None of this was violent or dramatic, but it was quietly unsettling. Still, most prisoners explained these observations away. An army could appear efficient even if the nation behind it was fragile. Germany, they told themselves, had endured shortages, bombing, and sacrifices because it was committed to total war. America, far from the front lines, could not possibly maintain such effort for long. This belief hardened as the prisoners were moved from temporary holding areas toward major ports. Many assumed they would be kept close to the front, or perhaps exchanged. Few believed the rumors spreading through the camps. Then the rumors became orders. They were not staying in Europe or Africa. They were being sent across the Atlantic, deep into the United States. The announcement caused confusion and disbelief. Transporting tens of thousands of prisoners across an ocean filled with submarines seemed excessive, even reckless. Some laughed it off. Others felt a flicker of fear. But many felt a strange sense of pride. If they were going to see America, they expected to witness a nation unprepared for a real industrial war. As they boarded the ships under firm but professional guard, that belief still held. The guards did not abuse them. The process was efficient. Everything moved on time. To most prisoners, this meant nothing. Germany, they believed, remained the true industrial power. America was about to be exposed. The Atlantic crossing did not feel like a victory march, but it did not feel like punishment either. German prisoners were packed onto large transport ships and moved west under heavy guard. Submarines still haunted the ocean, yet the journey was steady and controlled. Meals arrived regularly. Medical care was available. Discipline was firm but predictable. For many prisoners, this was their first hint that the United States operated on a scale that felt different from anything they had known. Even moving thousands of enemy soldiers across a war zone appeared routine. Days at sea stretched into weeks. The prisoners talked constantly. Some repeated propaganda slogans, insisting America was wasting resources on comforts and appearances. Others were quieter, watching how smoothly the ships functioned. Engines ran without interruption. Supplies never seemed to run low. The convoy system worked. When escorts appeared and disappeared on the horizon, it felt organized, not improvised. This was not the behavior of a nation struggling to survive. When land finally appeared, expectations clashed with reality almost immediately. Instead of ruined ports or desperate civilians, they saw calm harbors and intact infrastructure. Cranes moved cargo with precision. Trucks rolled in steady lines. There was no sense of panic or emergency. The war felt distant here, almost abstract. For prisoners who had lived under constant bombing or rationing, this calm was deeply unsettling. They were marched off the ships and processed with speed and efficiency. Paperwork, inspections, medical checks, and transport orders followed one another without delay. Guards gave clear instructions. There was no shouting, no confusion. Everything moved according to schedule. Even those who remained loyal to Nazi ideology found it difficult to ignore what they were seeing. This did not look like a country overstretched by war. Then came the trains. The prisoners were loaded into long railcars, guarded but not hidden. Curtains were not drawn. Doors were not sealed shut. As the trains pulled away from the ports and moved inland, the prisoners gathered at the windows. What they expected was emptiness. What they saw was movement, endless movement. Rail yards appeared first. Tracks spread in every direction. Locomotives stood nose to tail, waiting their turn. Freight cars rolled past loaded with coal, steel, vehicles, and equipment. Some trains seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. As the prisoners watched, more trains passed in the opposite direction, moving just as fast, just as full. This was not a single hub. It was everywhere. As hours turned into days, the view did not change. Factories rose along the tracks, one after another. Smoke poured from stacks without pause. Assembly buildings were massive, larger than anything most prisoners had ever seen. Some recognized shapes, aircraft components, armored vehicles, and heavy machinery. There were no signs of scarcity. No signs of slowdown. Everything looked permanent, as if it had always been this way. Inside the railcars, conversations grew quieter. Jokes faded. Arguments stopped. Some prisoners pressed their faces to the glass in silence. Others stared straight ahead, refusing to look. What they were seeing could not be explained away. This was not propaganda. This was geography. It went on, mile after mile, state after state. By the time the trains reached deeper into the country, something had shifted. The war no longer felt undecided. For the first time, many of these men began to understand that the battlefield might not matter anymore. The outcome was being decided here, far from the front lines, by machines that never stopped. When the trains finally slowed, the prisoners expected the vision to end. Instead, it followed them. As they stepped down onto American soil in the interior of the country, the same sense of order surrounded them. Guards moved with calm authority. Camp signs were clear and standardized. Barracks stood in neat rows. Everything looked planned, measured, and permanent. There was no sign that this system had been thrown together in an emergency. It looked as though it had been waiting for them. For many prisoners, this moment carried more weight than their capture. On the battlefield, chaos was normal. Here, there was none. The camps were not luxurious, but they were efficient. Food was basic and plentiful. Medical care was routine. Supplies arrived on time. The prisoners quickly realized that even holding tens of thousands of enemy soldiers required only a fraction of America's attention. The machinery of daily life continued around them, unaffected by their presence. As days passed, work details were organized. Some prisoners were sent to nearby farms. Others worked in maintenance or unloading supplies. Under the Geneva Convention, they were paid small wages and treated according to strict rules. For men who had been told Americans were brutal and undisciplined, this reality was deeply confusing. It forced them to confront an uncomfortable question. If the enemy could afford to be this controlled, this confident, then how deep did their resources truly go? The answer became clearer whenever prisoners were transported outside the camps. Trains passed constantly, loaded with raw materials and finished goods. Trucks moved in steady lines along paved roads. Factories operated day and night, their lights glowing long after sunset. Even in rural areas, machinery dominated the landscape. Tractors replaced horses. Harvesters moved with mechanical precision. Food was not merely grown. It was produced at scale. German prisoners began comparing what they saw to conditions at home. By this stage of the war, German cities were damaged. Rail lines were bombed. Fuel was scarce. Factories were dispersed or destroyed. Production was interrupted constantly by air raids. In contrast, America's industrial centers lay untouched. Nothing slowed them down. There were no bomb shelters here. No blackouts. No ruins. Inside the camps, conversations changed. The loudest voices tried to dismiss what they had seen. They blamed distance. Some prisoners began to keep mental counts. How many factories had they passed? How many trains in a single hour? How many machines replacing human labor? The answers frightened them. This was not just an industrial advantage. It was a system designed to multiply itself. One factory fed another. One rail line supported dozens more. The longer the war lasted, the stronger America became. For many, this was the moment belief collapsed. Not all at once, but quietly. They did not announce it. They did not celebrate or protest. They simply understood something they had never been allowed to understand before. Germany could fight bravely. It could innovate. It could sacrifice. But it could not outproduce this. Not ever. And the most disturbing part was still ahead. The train journeys did not end with arrival at the camps. Again and again, prisoners were moved across the country from temporary holding areas to permanent camps, and from one labor assignment to another. Each time, the same rule applied. The prisoners could see outside. Curtains stayed open. Windows were not blocked. What began as transportation slowly became a lesson no one could ignore. The scale revealed itself in layers. First came the rail networks. Tracks ran side by side in numbers the prisoners had never imagined. Switching yards stretched for miles, filled with locomotives and freight cars waiting their turn. Everything moved on a schedule. Trains passed in both directions, loaded to capacity, never stopping for long. For men used to sabotage lines and delayed shipments, this alone was shocking. Then came the factories. Not hidden or dispersed, but standing openly beside the tracks. Steel mills roared day and night. Assembly plants sprawled across vast areas, their buildings larger than entire German industrial districts. Smoke rose constantly, not from damage but from production. Prisoners recognized the outlines of war material without being told: aircraft fuselages and tank hulls. Engines stacked in rows. Nothing suggested haste or desperation. This was steady, controlled output. As the trains pushed farther inland, the landscape changed, but the message remained the same. Industrial cities gave way to farmland, yet production did not slow. Fields stretched to the horizon, worked by machines instead of men. Tractors pulled equipment wider than village roads back home. Harvesters moved with mechanical rhythm. Grain silos towered over the plains like fortresses of food. For prisoners who had lived with ration cards and hunger, this abundance was difficult to process. Inside the railcars, silence replaced debate. Men who once argued politics now counted smokestacks. Others stared without speaking, their faces pressed against the glass. Some refused to look at all, turning their backs as if denial might preserve something. The train became a moving courtroom, and the evidence passed by without pause. This was the moment when understanding turned into certainty. Bombing raids, soldiers realized, were not the real weapon. The real weapon was distance, safety, and uninterrupted production. America's factories did not fear air raids. Its farms were untouched. Its rail lines were intact. Every day the war continued, this system grew stronger, while Germany's weakened. Prisoners began to say it quietly, almost ashamed. The war could not be won this way. Not against this. Even if Germany built better weapons, it could not build enough of them. Even if soldiers fought harder, they could not replace losses fast enough. The imbalance was too great. Some later said that this train ride broke them more completely than capture ever did. On the battlefield, hope could survive. Here, watching mile after mile of industry pass by, hope had nowhere to hide. The war was not being decided by generals alone. It was being decided by machines that never slept. By the time the trains slowed again, many prisoners already knew the truth. They were not just prisoners of war. They were witnesses to an outcome that could no longer be changed. What the prisoners had seen so far was only the surface. As the trains continued their journeys, the industrial landscape seemed to deepen, not fade. Rail yards grew larger instead of smaller. Some stretched so far that the end could not be seen from the windows. Tracks overlapped and branched endlessly, filled with cars marked for steel, coal, fuel, vehicles, and machinery. Everything moved with purpose. Nothing sat idle for long. To men who had watched German rail lines crumble under bombing and shortages, this uninterrupted flow felt unreal. Factories appeared in clusters, then in chains, then in entire regions built around production alone. Steel mills thundered without pause, their furnaces glowing day and night. Nearby stood plants shaping raw metal into engines, armor plates, and aircraft parts. Further down the line, assembly facilities completed the process. It became clear that no single factory stood alone. Each was part of a system feeding the next. If one slowed, another compensated. This was not just industry. It was industrial coordination on a continental scale. The prisoners began to notice something even more disturbing. There were no visible defenses. No camouflage. No attempts to hide these facilities. Smokestacks rose openly into the sky. Windows were lit at night. Production continued as if attack were impossible. This was not arrogance. It was geography. The factories were safe because nothing could reach them. For the first time, many prisoners understood what it meant to fight a war from the other side of an ocean. As the trains passed through different states, and the pattern repeated endlessly. One industrial center blended into another. When factories thinned, warehouses replaced them. When warehouses ended, fuel depots appeared. Oil tanks lined the tracks in rows that seemed to go on forever. Every element of modern war passed by the windows in finished form, already prepared, already moving toward distant battlefields. Some prisoners tried to compare what they saw to Germany's efforts late in the war, underground factories and dispersed workshops. Production halted by air raids and power shortages, workers exhausted, hungry, and afraid. Here, there was none of that. American workers went home that night. Machines took over where labor ended. Electricity flowed without interruption. The contrast was unbearable. Quiet conversations began to form a single conclusion. This was not a temporary surge. It was not an emergency effort. America had built its economy for mass production long before the war. The conflict had simply given it direction. Once turned toward war, the system did not strain. It accelerated. For many prisoners, this realization was crushing. Courage, sacrifice, and ideology suddenly felt small. They understood that bravery could not destroy factories this far away. Skill could not erase numbers like these. No battlefield victory could outweigh what they were seeing roll past their eyes. Later, some would say this was the moment the war ended for them personally. Not with surrender. Not with imprisonment. But here, watching America's industrial heartbeat without pause. The factories did not care who won the next battle. They only cared that production continued. And it always did. As the trains left the industrial cities behind, the prisoners expected a pause, a return to normal countryside. What they encountered instead was a different kind of power, America's farms. The landscape shifted, but the lesson remained the same. Endless fields stretched to the horizon, worked not by human hands alone, but by machines that moved with mechanical precision. Tractors plowed in long, straight lines. Combine harvesters swept across wheat and corn with relentless efficiency. Irrigation systems and silos towered over the land, and every piece of equipment seemed to operate without pause, as if fed by the same invisible force that drove the factories. For the prisoners, many of whom had grown up in small German villages or war-torn urban areas, the scale was shocking. Farms in Germany were still labor-intensive, patched together from generations of small plots. Machines were few, fuel scarce, and manpower exhausted. Here in the United States, one field could feed thousands. One region could feed an entire army. They watched as teams of tractors and harvesters worked in perfect coordination, the land producing far more than any individual effort could achieve. Every day seemed to bring new proof of abundance. The scale of mechanized farming was one revelation. The second was the coordination. Rail lines fed into grain elevators. Trucks moved harvested crops to distribution centers. Warehouses stored food in unimaginable quantities. Everything had its place and its schedule. Nothing was wasted. Nothing slowed. For men who had seen entire harvests destroyed by war, mismanagement, or bombing, this was a kind of industrial perfection applied to agriculture. The realization was quietly terrifying. In the railcars, the conversations among prisoners had shifted again. Some men, who had earlier dismissed what they saw as temporary or exaggerated, now began to whisper calculations. How many trains carried food? How many tractors operated in a single region? How many miles of rail connected farms to cities and factories? Slowly, they understood that American agriculture alone could sustain war without stress. Germany could never match it. Even if every farmer were drafted, even if every worker labored day and night, the numbers would not come close. Some prisoners began to speak more openly. They compared their experiences to life back home: food rationing, shortages, and exhausted labor. Here, there was neither hunger nor delay. Mechanization allowed a single operator to accomplish what hundreds could not. The prisoners began to realize that the war effort was not just about guns, tanks, and bombs. It was about sustained production of everything needed to fight. And America was doing it on a scale they had never imagined. The psychological effect of this realization was profound. Soldiers trained to fight, to endure, to innovate under pressure, now felt powerless in a new way. The battlefield was no longer the place where outcomes were decided. Even the most skilled generals and bravest soldiers could not undo the advantage of production that spanned entire states. The war's momentum, the prisoners began to understand, was already moving against Germany. The railcars, the factories, and the farms were a single, unstoppable force. By the time the trains carried them past one more endless stretch of wheat or corn, the truth was undeniable. America's war machine was not a myth. It was not a temporary surge. It was a network of industry, agriculture, and logistics operating with relentless efficiency. Germany's armies, no matter how brave or disciplined, were already behind. And this realization, quiet and invisible, struck harder than any battlefield defeat. By now, the prisoners were beginning to understand something that no single battle could have taught them. As the train carried them farther into the heart of the United States, the endless factories, rail yards, and mechanized farms formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The evidence was not in a single building or shipment. It was in the sheer scale, the continuous motion, and the coordination of a nation operating at full capacity. For the first time, many of the German soldiers admitted, silently even to themselves, that they were witnessing the true power of America. Inside the railcars, conversations grew quieter and more reflective. Soldiers who had once joked about their American captors now spoke in hushed tones. They compared numbers in their heads, calculated distances, and imagined how long Germany would take to match even a fraction of what they were seeing. Some refused to talk at all, pressing their faces to the windows, eyes wide, taking in the relentless parade of production. The realization was sinking in: Germany could not outproduce this. It was not just the factories that stunned them, but the integration of the entire system. Trains carried raw materials to steel mills, steel moved to assembly plants, machinery built machines, and food from massive farms fed the workers. Everything had rhythm, purpose, and efficiency. Each part of the system fed the next, creating an unstoppable chain. A single factory might impress, but hundreds of factories, connected by endless rail lines and supported by mechanized agriculture, created a scale of war production that Germany simply could not compete with. For some, the moment of understanding was almost physical. Years of propaganda, pride, and belief in German superiority could not survive what they were witnessing. They began to whisper among themselves, recognizing that ideology and courage alone would not win wars against a nation capable of producing so much so quickly. Some calculated the numbers of planes, tanks, and trucks they passed in a single hour, and the math was devastating. Germany, even at full mobilization, could not replace losses at this speed. The realization spread quietly but rapidly through the ranks. Hardline Nazis tried to maintain the illusion, insisting that Americans would tire or make mistakes, but the evidence was unshakable. Production never stopped. Trains never slowed. Factories operated day and night. Farms produced relentlessly. Even natural obstacles, like rivers and mountains, had been overcome with bridges, rail spurs, and logistical planning. The prisoners began to see that the war was not being decided by guns or bombs alone, but by a system so vast and well-coordinated that it felt invincible. By the time the trains slowed for camp arrivals, the transformation in understanding was complete. Men who had believed in a winnable war now felt a silent despair. The battles they had fought, the courage they had shown, and the sacrifices they had endured were dwarfed by a scale of production they could not hope to match. The war was slipping from their grasp, not because of any single enemy action, but because of the relentless, invisible strength of America's industrial and agricultural machine. Years later, in interviews preserved by the Library of Congress, many former prisoners reflected on this journey. They all remembered the same feeling, a slow, dawning comprehension that Germany had already lost before the first shot was fired in American factories, before the first tractor moved across the plains. The realization came quietly, but its impact was permanent. It was the understanding that ideology and bravery could not defeat a nation that had mastered the art of producing more than any army could consume. Inside the camps, the conversations among the prisoners revealed the full psychological weight of what they had seen. At first, many tried to dismiss the train journeys as exaggeration or coincidence. Some argued that the Americans were lucky, that resources would run out, or that Germany could still strike and destroy key facilities. But as days turned into weeks, the evidence became undeniable. The men could no longer ignore the scale and efficiency of a nation untouched by war on its own soil. Their discussions shifted from bravado to quiet reflection, and a new understanding began to take root. Soldiers compared notes about the endless rail yards, the massive factories, and the mechanized farms. They spoke of mile after mile of production, the continuous movement of trains loaded with tanks, planes, and raw materials. They described the fields stretching as far as the eye could see, cultivated by powerful tractors and combined harvesters that required only a handful of operators. The realization spread slowly, almost like a contagion, that Germany could never outproduce this kind of power. One by one, prisoners admitted to themselves that no matter how brave or skilled they were on the losing side of a war determined not by courage alone, but by industrial capacity. This understanding cut deeper than defeat on the battlefield ever could. In Europe, soldiers had learned to adapt, to hide, to survive raids, and to make do with less. They could fight with discipline, even when resources were scarce. But the United States offered no scarcity. Its railways delivered endlessly. Its factories operated day and night. Its farms produced food faster than entire villages in Germany could harvest. Here, the war machine ran on a scale and rhythm that Germany could not hope to match, and the prisoners knew it. They began to realize that even heroic resistance on the front lines would be meaningless if the enemy could replace losses tenfold. The psychological effects were subtle but profound. Hardline Nazis in the camps attempted to maintain morale by arguing that Americans could not sustain this pace forever, that German ingenuity would find a way, or that victory could still be claimed with the right strategy. But even these arguments felt hollow against the evidence. The men had seen it with their own eyes. Every day, the country's resources moved efficiently, without interruption, without panic. The war effort was not being waged only on battlefields. It was waged in factories, farms, and rail yards, and it was winning before the first shell had been fired. The prisoners began to reflect on their own country with increasing despair. Germany was exhausted. Its cities lay in ruins, its factories bombed, its railways broken. Food and fuel were scarce. Labor was overworked and underfed. In comparison, America appeared limitless. One train ride across the Midwest could show what Germany could never build or sustain in a lifetime. For many, this understanding replaced fear with a deep, resigned certainty. The war, it seemed, was already decided far from the battlefield. Years later, Historians like Arnold Krammer and interviews archived by the Library of Congress would confirm what the prisoners had felt. The train journeys across the United States were a turning point in perception, even if not in combat. These men, once confident and defiant, emerged from the experience with a quiet, unavoidable truth. Germany had lost not on the battlefield, but in the shadow of an industrial and agricultural system whose scale, speed, and efficiency they could never match. The factories and farms were silent, invisible weapons that no soldier could destroy, and the prisoners understood, perhaps for the first time, the full extent of America's power. The true power of the United States was not found on the battlefield, and the German prisoners understood this better than anyone. It was invisible, intangible in the way a cannon or a tank could be seen, yet it was more decisive than any weapon they had faced. They had glimpsed it from the windows of moving trains, an entire nation mobilized with a precision that made every factory, rail yard, and farm part of a single, unstoppable war machine. The enemy was not just the American soldier. It was the coordination, the speed, and the sheer volume of production that no army could hope to destroy. This invisible weapon had many faces. There were the steel mills producing endless hulls for tanks and ships, the aircraft plants where components were assembled into planes that would fill the skies of Europe and the Pacific, the railroads, moving raw materials to factories and finished goods to ports. There were the farms that fed millions of civilians and soldiers alike, mechanized to operate with the precision of clockwork. The scale was overwhelming. Every piece worked in harmony with the next, forming a network of production that could sustain war indefinitely. The prisoners began to understand that the consequences of this system were far-reaching. Even the most courageous or skilled German soldier could not counter it. Battles could be won or lost, but losses could always be replaced. Equipment destroyed could be rebuilt. Food shortages could be prevented. Fuel could be delivered without delay. Germany's best efforts, no matter how heroic, could never keep pace. The war was being fought and lost thousands of miles from the front lines, in factories and fields, by people who might never fire a gun in anger but whose labor and organization determined the outcome. In the camps, the men spoke quietly of what they had seen, though fear and disbelief still lingered in some. Years later, interviews with former prisoners would reveal the same story again and again. They recalled the endless trains, the massive factories, and the mechanical farms with awe and a sense of quiet despair. They realized that the scale of American production made Germany's sacrifices insufficient. They had underestimated the enemy not because of courage or skill, but because of the hidden strength of an industrial system that Germany could not match. This understanding reshaped the way they saw the war. Ideology, morale, and battlefield valor mattered far less than the uninterrupted ability to produce more than the enemy could destroy. The invisible weapon of the United States was not held in the hands of soldiers but in the infrastructure of an entire nation. It moved silently across the landscape, delivered supplies without pause, and fed, armed, and equipped the forces that would eventually march into Europe and the Pacific. For the prisoners watching from the trains, this was a revelation more powerful than any artillery barrage or aerial attack. By the time the war ended, many of these prisoners could trace the moment they truly understood the scale of America's advantage. It was not the surrender, not the imprisonment, but the slow realization that the United States could produce endlessly, feed its armies, supply its allies, and never run out of the material needed to fight. The invisible weapon had already won the war before the first American shot was fired in Europe. It was the quiet, relentless force of production, efficiency, and coordination, a force that German soldiers could only witness in stunned silence. When the war finally ended and the prisoners returned home, the lessons of their journey across America stayed with them. Years later, in interviews preserved by the Library of Congress, former German soldiers recalled the long train rides, the endless factories, the mechanized farms, and the sheer scale of production with vivid detail. They spoke not of combat, not of bombs, but of the realization that Germany had already lost the war long before soldiers set foot on American soil. The scale of the industrial and agricultural machine they had witnessed was, in their own words, overwhelming and unstoppable. Many reflected on how the train ride shattered their assumptions. Nazi propaganda had convinced them that America was weak, divided, and incapable of sustained war. Yet mile after mile of steel, smoke, and machinery told a different story. Every rail yard, every plant, every farm demonstrated a nation operating at peak efficiency, capable of supplying armies across oceans, feeding millions, and replacing losses faster than Germany could destroy. The war was no longer about courage or tactics. It was about production, and America had mastered it. Historians like Arnold Krammer later confirmed the psychological impact of these journeys. German POWs often ranked the train rides as among the most sobering experiences of the war. Some said the battlefield victories they had fought for suddenly felt irrelevant. What mattered now was the scale of what they had witnessed: the factories that never stopped, the rail lines that never emptied, the farms that seemed to stretch forever. The realization was subtle but absolute: Germany could not compete with a nation capable of producing more than it could ever lose. For many, this understanding came slowly, almost painfully. Initially, they tried to dismiss what they saw. Perhaps it was temporary. Perhaps luck or geography would run out. But the longer they watched, the more impossible denial became. The production machine was continuous, efficient, and beyond the reach of bombs, sabotage, or even human endurance. By the time they returned home, this knowledge had become ingrained. The outcome of the war had been decided not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, unstoppable hum of American factories and farms. Some former prisoners said they carried this realization for the rest of their lives. It shaped their understanding of power, logistics, and the nature of modern warfare. They had witnessed a nation mobilized not just for survival, but for absolute efficiency. Courage could be heroic, tactics could be brilliant, but neither could overcome the relentless, invisible weapon of production that they had seen stretch across states and continents. In retrospect, they understood that Germany's defeat was inevitable once they'd boarded those trains, not because of bullets or bombs, but because of America's industrial and agricultural might. The story of these POWs is not just a tale of captivity, but a story of awakening. It reveals that wars are not won solely by armies or generals, but by the capacity of a nation to sustain its effort, to feed, equip, and transport its forces faster than the enemy can destroy them. The German prisoners' astonishment was proof of what historians have long known: America's strength during World War II lay not just in its soldiers, but in the scale, speed, and coordination of its industrial power, a force so vast and invisible that it could stun even those trained to fight it.